Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, subscribe, Facebook, and Telegram. You can support me on Subscribestar, Buy Me a Coffee, and Locals. And also don't forget to check out my Substack. I'm once again joined by Jason from the excellent channel Think Anomalous. Glad to have you back, Jason. This might be our fourth or fifth time now.
Yeah, I think it's our fourth time. Happy to be back. Thanks.
Now, I know you've actually done some videos on reincarnation, and that's always been an interesting topic to investigate for paranormal or stuff, or even philosophical stuff, right? So why don't you give us a breakdown of the basic ideas that people think of when they think of reincarnation?
Sure. So reincarnation is just basically the idea that when you die, your soul or whatever part of you that survives death actually embodies in another person. It's usually thought to happen about a year later. It can sometimes happen decades later or thousands of years later. It's a common belief in pretty much every Eastern religion, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, in some of the more esoteric traditions in Western religion. For example, the medieval Cathars believed in reincarnation. Some early Gnostic sects believed in reincarnation. Some Kabbalic Jews believe in reincarnation, but generally it's kind of sidelined in favor of this idea of a soul, and a judgment and, eternity in heaven or hell, or eternity in the afterlife.
Okay, so yeah, there's a lot. I've been thinking about the question of reincarnation for a long time now. As a Christian, I don't believe in reincarnation, but the objections that I'm going to raise are going to be more first principles rational, since you can't always since obviously someone who believes in reincarnation isn't going to share the same priors that I do. So the first thing that I would say is that when we talk about reincarnation like this, it kind of sounds like a mechanism or a system where souls are sort of cycled through bodies through some sort of, you said, time interval, maybe a year. The first question I would want to ask then is, okay, what also has to be true in your metaphysical assumptions for that to be true? That's the first one. And then closely related to that is what is the product of the first soul, right? So in a fully structured reincarnation system, when you die, right, you then reborn as someone else, and maybe even an animal. But so the souls are then recycled in a sense, right? But then, as a mechanism of soul migration, what accounts for the first soul? One, and then two, if we have another explanation for soul formation, why make an appeal to reincarnation in the first place?
Right. Okay. Well, big question. And let me be clear here. I mean, this is something we talked about before. We've kind of structured this as a more of a discussion than a debate. I personally don't necessarily believe in reincarnation. Where I come from, I'm just coming from kind of a data perspective. In doing research for the video I covered on this topic, I looked at the data collected by a psychiatrist named Ian Stevenson, who's actually Canadian, eventually settled at the University of Virginia. And he kind of was the first guy to go to India, where people had believed in reincarnation for a long time, and kind of collect all the data on it. So there are all these stories of children that remembered past lives. He would go interview the children, interview their families, and in many cases was able to follow up on the details that the children had provided and go find families in nearby towns that corresponded to those details. So, for example, there's a case of a kid named Ravi Shankar, not the famous Ravi Shankar, but a child in India who remembered being beheaded by a relative of his, like a scheming relative. And they were actually able to find that relative with the same name that the kid had identified in a nearby town. So basically what Ian Stevenson did was put together data that showed that there's some phenomenon there, or some phenomena at work. I don't necessarily believe in reincarnation as a explanation for that data, but I do believe in that data. To answer your question, I have the same concern. A million years ago, the human population was a tiny fraction of what it is today. And if those same souls are just being recycled over and over, well, how do we account for, the 9 billion people we're going to have in a few years? Clearly, more souls have to be added to the pool, or people have to be reincarnated in several different bodies to account for that great population growth. And and if populations were to decline, then what would happen to those souls? Do they get to be reincarnated, or they just kind of sit in the afterlife forever? So it's a good question. And I'm not sure how. I'm sure every tradition has a different explanation for that. I personally do not necessarily have an explanation for that.
Okay, maybe I should have been a little more clear on my end. Are you aware of any advocate of reincarnation who has proposed an answer to such an objection as I just raised?
I am not personally, no.
Okay. Well, the second one, you actually beat me to the punch, was population growth.
Right.
The first argument that I'm aware of this being made was Tertullian, the 3rd century church father, in his treatise on the soul. And he says, okay, well, if let's just limit it to humans, because you can also be reincarnated as an animal. We'll get there later. But how do you have population growth? Because you have to assume there's a fixed amount of people at any given time to have this cycle happen. Now, it gets even worse if you have animal populations. Because, of course, if you're a very evil or wicked person, you'll be reincarnated as an animal. Hence the ethical principles of vegetarianism and non-harm you find in the Vedic tradition, and even in certain esoteric Western traditions.
Right.
And the question then is, okay, well, you can't actually explain for population growth. And as far as I know, no contemporary responded to Tertullian, and this isn't a common objection you find, but I think it's one of the most powerful ones.
Yeah. It just occurred to me there is a potential explanation for that. Ian Stevenson had actually proposed in his very first book on the subject, kind of seminal book called 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation from, I think, 1967. And he had proposed the possession hypothesis, which would basically say that, these kids are being possessed by spirits of, deceased people. So they're not actually being reincarnated. That deceased soul is in heaven or in hell or in purgatory or somewhere else, but they're just possessing the body of this person and allowing them to kind of take on those memories. So I suppose in that case, it would be possible for, one spirit or one soul to possess the bodies of several people, thus accounting for, population growth. But Ian Stevenson also did not think that that was a very viable hypothesis. He didn't think it really explained the cases that he was looking at very well.
Well, I don't remember that. So that's a very interesting hypothesis to explain some of this phenomena.
I'll go over one more before you move on. This was also, I believe, suggested by Stevenson and by a parapsychologist named Stephen Browdy. And the idea is that these children are just accessing the memories of other people in the same way that, a medium can access the memories of a deceased person. So it's really a psi phenomena, more of a kind of telepathy or a mental connection with, other people living or dead, and not actually reincarnation.
You saying that made me think of another possible explanation. So amongst, this is more of a conception you'll find with like heroic literature or aristocratic literature, that there's like a blood memory. So the idea that, if you're of noble birth, right, you could have blood memories of. That's also why there's blood magic, right, in the occult, partly so you can tap into your, quote, own blood memories. And then you see this explored in a more abstract way with Frank Herbert in Dune, with the idea of prescience with Paul and Leto II. So it could be that these memories are actually the result of either, whether you want to call it blood memory or prescience or whatever. The idea is that there is this genetic linkage between people. Right. And that you could still have that even if you didn't experience. See, if you're a child and you are tapping into this genetic linked memory, you wouldn't be able to have the presence of mind to say, I didn't live through that, but I remembered somebody else living through it, right? It would be like Alia in the 3rd Dune book, where Baron Harkonnen just takes over and she loses control of herself. Right. Because it's this unlocked memory from her drinking the water of life. Well, her mother drinking the water of life. So that's actually a very interesting hypothesis.
There's also, of course, Jung's famous concepts of the collective unconscious, that we all kind of share something, these kind of cultural evolutionary memories. But that was, sort of more on the level of kind of symbolism, and I don't know that it would really translate to the really kind of cogent kind of memories that these kids have. I'll also bring up another thing I think that maybe helps you see this from a different perspective. There was a researcher named Helen Wambach from JFK University who studied past memories through hypnosis. So she would bring in patients, have people do past life regression hypnosis on them, and basically ask them to remember previous lives. And these people would frequently come up with these really detailed memories of, you know, life in ancient Rome or in ancient Egypt. And she would ask them to recall very specific things. You know, what kind of shoes were you wearing? What, you know, what utensils did you use to eat? What were the foods you were eating? And people would come up with extremely detailed answers to these questions. And when checked against, you know, historical knowledge of these people, actually checked out. So people who, you know, knew nothing of Egyptian cuisine would actually be able to describe exactly what the ancient Egyptians were eating. Something that was only known to them, you know, when they consulted researchers after the fact. So in that case, you know, that again seems to kind of support the kind of psi phenomena interpretation, that it's not necessarily that these people are actually reincarnated and continuing these memories from previous lives, but that they're actually just simply able to recall memories from other people, just even at will, you know.
Yeah. So the third objection that I have is, now this is going to be rooted in a certain conception of the soul. Now, if someone doesn't share this conception of the soul, this will be a correspondingly weaker objection. But I find Aristotle's description, I believe it's found in De Anima, is very compelling. The soul is tripartite, not that it has three parts, but that the human soul has three qualities, what he calls vegetative, animal, and rational. So all living things have a vegetative soul, including plants. They just grow. Animals have a rational soul, which includes it includes sentience and motility, which vegetables don't have. And then the rational soul is what humans have, which is the ability to reason. Now, if you believe humans can be reincarnated as animals, now we have a problem. Can a soul lose one of its properties?
Right.
So if man has a rational soul and animals don't, are you even the same creature anymore if you're reincarnated as a cat?
Right.
Because the cat doesn't have a rational soul because it's a cat.
Right.
And now I think that if you're a Western Hermeticist, that's a problem because you are familiar with Aristotle. I'm sure the Kabbalists and, you know, Plato, well, subsequent Platonists were familiar with Aristotle. Right. I think that's a big problem because can a soul lose its properties? And if you say yes, well, that's a whole bunch of other problems I'll get to in a moment. But you'd have to say yes, because if you're believing in reincarnation, because a man could become reincarnated as an animal.
Right.
What would you say to that?
I guess explanation would be that, you know, the soul wouldn't lose any properties, but it just simply takes on the body of something that isn't able to express those properties. Again, I don't know. I guess you're kind of pulling apart the whole concept of the soul at that point. But yeah, your soul survives. Maybe you have a conscious experience of a human, but you're just a blade of grass, and all you can really do is blow in the wind until you're reincarnated as a human or a tiger again, and have those higher faculties to actually express that.
Yeah. Now, the next thing up to that explanation, there are accounts of animals in history that are supremely wily, which often confuses or bold. So, for example, there was in the early 15th century, when Paris froze and the Seine froze during the 100 Years' War, an army of wolves invaded, led by a wolf named Colteau, because his tail had been cut by a postern gate closing. And he had, beyond the capacity of a normal wolf, certain, malice and intellect, which I suppose, had they been inclined to, they might have said was a reincarnated man who was just malicious. But the next point then is reincarnation in animals are tied into both Western Hermetic tradition and Eastern Vedic tradition with vegetarianism. Because it's good, it's bad karma to eat meat.
Right.
But here's the problem. If an evil man is reincarnated as a lion and he eats meat, that's bad karma.
Right.
From that perspective. So now what you have to say then is he's being punished by being given a, quote, luxury that the adept isn't given, because the adept isn't supposed to eat meat.
Right.
So how is that a punishment? And then what about the gazelle? Maybe the gazelle was reincarnated too. And so now you have cannibalism, where one human is eating another human.
Right.
Like, where does the karma, that seems to go against the grain of karma, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, it's just kind of lock you in some spiral of just being reincarnated into worse and worse forms and never being able to escape that spiral.
Right, which would defeat the point of karma, because the point of karma, from almost all practitioners of it, at least I'm aware of, is to eventually realize the mistake you made in that past life and then come to a higher level of consciousness.
Right, and then actually escape the cycle of rebirth.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And I don't see how that could happen
Yeah.
in those contexts, which sort of defeats, at least in my mind, one part of this.
Right.
And so I think that's a big problem, because because if eating meat's wrong from this highest ethical perspective, and then you're punishing someone by having them eat meat,
right?
Wouldn't the punishment be not to eat meat?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any writings by anybody that deals with that particular issue?
No, I really didn't get into kind of deep Hindu philosophy on it or anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah, personally, I lean towards the psi explanation. I think, and I think if you take in data from other fields and other, anomalous phenomena, you realize it kind of explains a lot of different phenomena. For example, I know a guy who did ayahuasca, the hallucinogenic plant medicine, and he had this little flash of a memory of, standing in like something like a rice paddy, standing in some water, surrounded by these other people, looked like they were maybe in ancient Southern America, an Aztec or Mayan civilization. And, there were all these women, with babies on their backs, holding baskets and things, having just finished a harvest. And the babies were crying and everyone was sad. And there was just this overwhelming feeling that, the harvest had failed and that they were in for really dark times. And he just had that little flash of memory. He said it was extremely vivid, recalling in great detail all the people around him, the faces of the people crying, and then just kind of snapped out of it. So, you have to ask yourselves, is that evidence of a past life of his? Did he just become possessed by the spirit of a deceased person from, ancient Aztec civilization? Or was it just a psi phenomenon? Was he just sort of accessing, the collective memory of humanity, or accessing someone else's consciousness from the past for a brief moment in time?
Yeah, I like the idea of, like I said, using the Dune lingo, prescience, or the more traditional idea of a blood memory, or the more modern idea of Jung's collective unconscious, because all of them seem to be converging on the point that not only can individuals have experiences they remember, but entire cultures and people groups can have collective memories that they hold on to, not just through oral tradition and literature, but through some sort of tangible connection spiritually. I think that's a pretty powerful way to look at a lot of these.
And it would explain, so many things, just like telepathy, parents who, see visions of their children as they're, dying in a car accident or something, miles away. There's, tons of evidence that we are on some level related and can access each other's memories and each other's emotions and each other's feelings. Some people can do it on command. Some people can read minds, psychic connections between twins, all sorts of evidence all over the world. And I think that's all kind of related to the so-called reincarnation phenomenon. I mean, what we're really talking about from a phenomenological point of view is children with memories, right? With memories that correspond to real people, often in the past. That's really the phenomenon we're talking about. Reincarnation is just sort of an explanation for that phenomenon.
Right. I would agree. Now, they might not have used such scientific terms in the Vedas or Pythagoras or Plato, but I think, again, these ideas have to come from somewhere, right? And so where they're probably coming from. Now, if we want to go, we want to dovetail with your own research into the flying airships and then Jacques Vallée's idea of these extra-dimensional beings, it could also be that those beings, for whatever reason, wanted to seed those ideas to ancient peoples in order to, because you did an excellent video on Jacques Vallée on your channel where he says, when you look at the gods of ancient Greece, the fairies and gnomes of medieval Europe, and then modern day UFOs, they all follow the same pattern. They just have a different shape or appearance. And we could also say that there could be a seeding quality to this as well.
Right.
What would you say to that?
Sort of seeding quality in the sense that there's some outside force that's trying to seed this idea of reincarnation?
Yes. Right. So there's the observed data that you're talking about, which could drive the speculation. But I think also too, if you want to include this meta perspective, you could also say that there were these higher intelligences that, for whatever reason, wanted people to think that, whether it was true or not.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I had never considered that before. I mean, I guess my first observation would be that they clearly failed in the kind of Western tradition. I mean, reincarnation is so rare in Western traditions, and if that was the goal to see this across the world population, then it was only sort of halfway successful, right?
Well, right. It's only halfway successful, but I think but I think the people who claim to be advocates of it at like the root of the intellectual stream, so in India and then in Greece, they would claim that they heard this from a divine source. That's how they would have interpreted this knowledge. They might even have claimed to be divine themselves, like the quasi-mythical Hermes thrice great, because of course Hermes is the name of the messenger god of the Greeks.
Right.
But the other explanation, though, back to my first objection about the mechanism, how was the first soul made? And if it was made in some other way than reincarnation, why not just assume it's still there? Someone might say that, well, since everything is God, pantheism, that's certainly a belief in India, that the first soul was just some God stuff. And then from that God stuff, we just had this process develop out, which will then one day collapse back into God, which we call moksha, the enlightenment, the awakening. But then we have a problem here, because what conception of God are we using? Because, for example, most conceptions of God view God as omniscient, which we can say means at least one thing, that God does not have false beliefs. But all humans are plagued with false beliefs. But if we're a part of God, then God has false beliefs, which then would make him not God by any definition of God that we have. Right. So I don't see how that gets you out of the problem either.
No. Yeah. I mean, another explanation is, simply that we're all just kind of fragments of consciousness, and, every person is really the same person at the end of the day. We're all just some different fragment of that one single consciousness. And that would, again, explain why we could have population growth, why the number of humans on the planet could fluctuate greatly and it wouldn't really matter. And that would, again, explain how we all have these shared memories, and we can all kind of tap into each other's memories and tap into each other's emotions.
Right. That now we get to it. If we take that route, though, I think we still have the problem of false knowledge, because God, if we want to say that the collected consciousness reassembled is God, and we view this as like God is two endpoints, the beginning and the end, and this process is of fragmented consciousness in the middle, then God has a lot of false beliefs, but that's not an attribute that any tradition attributes to God. Right. God, being omniscient, doesn't have false beliefs, because he's omniscient, right? So it's difficult to see how that could actually be a part of God. I think ultimately what explains reincarnation as an explanation for the phenomena you observe and these other parapsychologists observe is a psychological one. So, for example, even if it might take quintillions of years for you to escape the cycle of death and rebirth, you never have to deal with what Dante says at the very beginning of his Divine Comedy, abandon a hope all ye who enter here. There's a psychological comfort in the fact that you don't ever have to take that bullet.
Right.
And I think that is a major, see, an argument can be compelling on two levels, psychological and rational. And sometimes it's hard to tell the two apart. I think a lot of the appeal of reincarnation is psychological.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's also, there's a guy named Walter Simcoe who looked into a lot of the data that Ian Stevenson collected, and he does these facial analyses and just trying to compare, the facial structure of people who, may or may not have been reincarnated. And he came up with this whole argument that people are kind of reincarnated in groups. And he did this whole breakdown of all the presidential candidates, and I think it was the 2000 election. It's when Ralph Nader was running. And he made this argument that every single person running in that election corresponded to someone in the American Revolution. So, I can't remember who he matched up with everybody, but, all those famous figures from the American Revolution, this idea that they kind of keep reincarnating in the political sphere, and that they keep kind of doing these political battles over generations. So it's this whole concept of kind of reincarnation groups. And that's maybe, you know, leads us to believe this idea that, you know, souls have kind of missions on Earth, and that, you know, if they don't kind of complete their mission in one lifetime, then they're reincarnated to try to carry that mission forward in another lifetime. There's also the Tibetan Buddhist idea of the Dalai Lama, that the Dalai Lama has been reincarnated, I think, over a dozen times since I think it's the 15th century. And then every time he's about to die, he tells his followers where he's going to reincarnate. They go chase that person down, find the reincarnated Dalai Lama as a child, and, you know, welcome him to the order again.
Yeah. Now, within this is back to possible explanations for this phenomena, which is what you really spend a lot of your time on. Is and this is taking it from a more specifically Western point of view. So, for example, Plato, he has a concept called I think it's called recapitulation, where he has the dialogue, the Meno, where he tries to draw out of this servant through the dialectical method of philosophy knowledge that he had from before his birth. And the idea being that there's this innate knowledge we have that is then explained. So what Plato's trying to explain here is innate knowledge. How do we have innate ideas prior to experience? And he's like, well, reincarnation. That's his answer. And then subsequent Platonists go down that route. Now, I think what's interesting here, though, is we have, in more modern times, I think, a better explanation. So Kant comes up with this idea that, so let's back it up. Hume argues we're a bundle of impressions where we just have all this sense data flooding our mind, and then, you know, whatever happens, happens. But then Kant asks a very good question. We make a judgment between different sense perceptions as to what is true, as to how to act under a given situation. And that judging faculty he calls the unity of apperception, where we then decide to discard certain sense perceptions in favor of something else, which indicates there's an already preloaded mechanism in the mind to allow us to do this. So then the question is, okay, well, what is the source of that mechanism, which is what Plato's observing in a very crude way. I think Kant is observing in a more complete way because he's 2,000 years later in the philosophical tradition, in part, right? So what I would then argue is, using that, we can then correlate this with Descartes' Meditations, where he argues, he makes the ontological argument for God, which, while interesting, is not the point of this discussion. But his argument basically says that God is a being with the property of aseity, that is self-existence. And there's nothing in our sensory experience that shows us a being with self-existence. So the idea itself needs an explanation. And the only thing that explains it is God himself, because where would we get it from if we don't experience it through our senses? So then the question becomes, well, who's the one preloading all this stuff into us? Who's the one building this mechanism that allows us to sort thought? And I think that, to use a modern terminology, we could say that God is like a computer programmer who is our minds or souls, or that immaterial part of ourselves, has the hardware that runs all of that stuff. And that's preloaded. And scientifically, we could look at the work of Noam Chomsky and his idea about language, saying, where he's sort of confirming Kant empirically by saying that we have these preloaded structures in the brain to have language. They're activated by hearing other people talk. We already have them. And so that already have knowledge, whether it's innate or in general or specific, like some guy's memory of ancient Egypt, could be, I think, better explained. And why is it a better explanation? Because it's simpler. It has fewer assumptions, right? Occam's razor. If you have to have a nearly infinite chain of soul migration versus this, I think we have the simpler explanation.
Right. Yeah, it reminds me some research. I can't remember who did it or where it was done, but it was research on rats and teaching them how to run mazes. And they basically found that, once you taught a kind of critical mass of rats to run this maze, then other rats, even at an entirely separate facility, would be better at running that maze. So this idea that, species kind of share learned knowledge or share memories in some way, and that successive generations, even if they weren't specifically taught that knowledge, will kind of inherit it from previous generations.
Right, right. And so, furthermore, within the Christian tradition, an example of this might be when God tells Noah that all animals will fear men. Right? They won't. There will still be the man-eating lion. That's an edge case example, but there's this new instilled, if you could say, program that animals are like, don't attack humans anymore. As a prey item, right? So that would imply that kind of a mechanism if that's the tradition you come out of, right? So I think the most parsimonious explanation for a lot of this is just that our minds, our brain, our souls are sort of preloaded by God with certain properties. Some are general properties that all humans have. And then maybe, think of like prophets or poets or philosophers. Some people have a little bit more given to them. Right. And that's what the Bible calls gifts, right? But the point is, though, these are all preloaded before birth into the soul of that person. Right. And it accounts for all the observations of Plato, all the observations of your parapsychologists, without necessarily having to go into this explanation of nearly infinite soul migration, which I think is just not as parsimonious.
Right. I'll bring up one example, one case Ian Stevenson looked into that maybe argues against that. There was a girl, I think she was in Sri Lanka, but it might have been India. Her name was Uttara Hudar, and she was kind of a unique case in that she had past life memories, or she actually identified as a previous person. She identified as a girl named Sharada, but only sometimes. Other times she did not identify and did not share consciousness with Sharada. Interesting thing was Uttara spoke Marathi, Sharada spoke Bengali. Uttara could only speak Bengali when she identified as Sharada. When she ceased identifying as Sharada, she could only speak Marathi again and had no knowledge of Bengali. So, there's kind of compartmentalized knowledge there. But at the same time, almost to counter that, Sharada's memories were of dying by being bitten by a snake on the big toe. And even when Uttara wasn't identifying as Sharada, she always had a phobia, a fear of snakes. So it's almost like on some kind of subconscious level, she inherits, some of the kind of unconscious fears and phobias of Sharada, but doesn't actually inherit her, intellectual kind of conscious memories, except for when, these periods when she does identify as Sharada. So it's almost like a multiple personality disorder where you see some weird things going on, where someone will have an allergy, for example, when identifying as one personality, but when their other personality takes over, they lose that allergy or have a different allergy.
Well, then I guess what I would want to say then is, if we use my theory that God is a programmer that just gives you this hardware before you're born, and then you could overlay on top of that some of the explanations you've already brought up, the possession hypothesis, which sounds an awful lot like, again, Frank Herbert's idea of possession with the past memories of Alia, which could then, again, tie back into some sort of genetic or blood memory or racial memory or whatever. And then you could also interpret that with an actual possession by an actual spirit. And so all three of those, depending on the context, could have an overlay that would refine and explain each of the observed facts, resting on this more fundamental assumption.
Right.
So how does that sound to you as an attempt to build a explanation for all of this different phenomena?
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, I guess I ultimately believe that we are tapping into some greater kind of collective conscious. How that works exactly, how it fragments into individuals, why we inherit some memories, some phobias, and we don't in other cases. I mean, I really don't have an explanation for it. Again, I'm just kind of focused on that data. I think there's some phenomena going on here. I think we need to take it seriously. I think reincarnation is sort of a viable explanation for it. But it doesn't necessarily account for all the data that we're talking about.
Right, or maybe a way to rephrase it is when we're doing this kind of like what we might call spiritual science, if you will. We, like in regular science, you have to make a inference, the best inference to the explanation, right? So you have evidence, and then from that evidence you infer the best explanation. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's the explanation. It might turn out to need refinement later on, right? But what I'm trying to propose here is that this matrix of ideas that I've put together here would be the best inference available to the explanation. What would you say to that claim?
Sure, I would agree with that. Yeah.
And again, that doesn't mean there can't be refinements. You know, for example, another thing that is adjacent, very adjacent to reincarnation, is I can't remember the guy's name, but there was some like edge case scientist who also dabbled in this parapsychological stuff, and he dealt with hauntings. So, for example, you might have a cliff where people commit suicide, and it's called, like, I don't know, Death Point, right? And then the first person jumps off and dies, and then you hear nothing about it for a while, and then somebody walks by and sees a ghost of that person jumping off the cliff. And that person might see that replay because he or she is also having the same dark night of the soul that person had. And then he or she jumps off the cliff. And then that keeps repeating in like a cycle. But he interpreted that as a kind of like reel, a film in the fabric of the universe where it wasn't so much that these people were still there doing this, but it was like a glitch where it kept repeating. And what triggered the repetition of the specter was someone's internal state.
Interesting. Yeah, it reminds me of a theory that they used to have, in hauntings, called the stone tape hypothesis. And it was just the idea, because a lot of these hauntings happened in old stone buildings in England, old castles and whatnot. This idea that somehow the stone itself sort of absorbed the memories or the experiences of these people that lived in these buildings, and then would kind of replay it over time. And, I thought that was fairly compelling at first, but I think when you really look into it, you realize that, all these haunting cases, it's not just the same memory. It's not just the same actions being repeated and repeated, like, someone's final moments hanging themselves in the castle. People actually experience interactions with these so-called spirits, with the spirits haunting the place. And yeah, can ask questions, can hear them answer questions and things like that. So there's clearly some sort of interactive component to it, which again would kind of lead you to believe that it's some spirit or some soul that's kind of lingering in the place and just occasionally kind of embodying, manifesting.
Well, what would you say to this explanation? Maybe there is a sort of like film reel, if you will, repeating in the stones of, say, a castle. But so in meditation and yoga, people might focus on like the flame, right? Because it focuses your thought during the process of meditation.
Right.
So what if that reel is like a thought focusing device that allows people then of a suggestible personality or of a disturbed emotional state to then be able to, for lack of a better word, open a portal to talk to other spirits on the other side. So it doesn't explain everything, but it's like a door that certain people can open if they're in a suggestible state.
Right. Yeah, and there definitely is that association with the state of the witness. I think that's an important thing. It's also an important thing in poltergeist cases where they find that, time after time, the victims of poltergeist activity are typically extremely emotionally troubled people. It's usually young individuals, like adolescents, and it's usually, troubled women. So there's clearly some connection with the state. I would agree with that, with the mental state of the person. That somehow, for whatever reason, that's sort of allows them to access the, these collective memories or this.
You bring up poltergeist. There's something I want to also run by you on this. This is a short story by the British author M.R. James called The Malice of Inanimate Objects, where basically there's two men who are friends. One is very suggestible and one is not. And the suggestible one views the fact that during their day, all these inanimate objects are just in the way, ruining his day. And eventually he dies. And so the idea then is that, well, somehow his friend who didn't have that suggestible state of mind was completely unaffected by the inanimate objects. Now, what if it were to be the case that rather than spirit activity, it's a kind of latent telepathy, which is triggered by emotionally unstable people?
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. A telepathy that can reach out to, people from the past, or kind of, tap into that collective unconscious or that place where souls go when people die, I suppose. Sure.
Now,
By that.
you mentioned the idea of a stone haunting. Now, there are three authors who, in the late 19th, early 20th century, represent a sort of popularization of a nascent spiritual science, sort of like doing the kind of work you're doing, and other parapsychologists are doing. Arthur Machen with his character Dyson, the occult investigator. Then you have William Hope Hodgson with Carnacki, the ghost hunter, and then you have Ogden and Blackwood with John Silence. Have you read or heard of any of these guys?
No, I have not.
I'm really surprised because there's a story by Ogden and Blackwood where there's a haunting in the stones of this castle, and I'm like, wow, that's just like what you're talking about.
Right.
And
now, the problem with that is, it's since been proven that there are hauntings everywhere. There are hauntings in suburban homes. There are hauntings in homes with drywall. And so this idea that has to be related to stone, I think, was sort of discarded. And I don't think you'll find a lot of parapsychologists and ghost hunters subscribing to the stone tape hypothesis anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But it was more just, I was trying to get at just this idea that this question of whether, are these interactions with these apparitions, are they just interactions with sort of moments in time from the past that are just sort of being replayed, or is it actually an interaction with a spirit or with some sort of personality or some sort of intelligence that can interact back with you?
Yeah, I think actually, depending on the case, it could be any one of those.
Mm-hmm.
Right, depending on the case,
sure.
Or even a combination of all of those, depending on the case. But
yeah.
I think what I've been trying to push at is the limits here of, with any sort of theological framework, whether it's a sort of like Eastern reincarnation framework or an Abrahamic framework of death and hell. Mm-hmm. Those seem to be the two conflicting frameworks we have today,
right?
Within our understanding of the spirit world. And then this seems to be, the disagreement then lies in which one is the best explanation. But what I would say is what I find unsatisfying and frustrating with the reincarnation, even with the most articulate Western Hermetic tradition like Plato, is that they don't seem to give fixed terms to describe the spirit world, because it seems to me it's like a goalpost thing where you think, okay, I got him, I got like the little paper soccer ball right here, shoot through here, and they move it.
Right.
What? No, you can't do that.
Right.
You can't go from here to here because I'm trying to meet you on your terms.
Sure.
And what it feels like with a lot of reincarnation articulation that I've seen, both classical Greek and Indian, and then also modern day, is that it tends to be this carousel where they just keep moving the point. And I'm like, well, okay, can I just get a definition of God, please?
Right.
Now we might revise that definition later. But the thing is, though, if we're going to talk about God and souls and creation, we're going to have to at least define what these things are.
Right.
So that we can then relate them to each other. And I find that reincarnation as a belief system is more common when that isn't done.
Right. No, I think you're right. Yeah. I think a lot of, the cultures, like there are, a few even Native American cultures that believe in reincarnation, like the Tlingit culture of, Tlingit, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, of the Alaskan Panhandle in northern BC. I don't think they spend a lot of time, trying to explain how this works or come up with some kind of rationalistic framework for understanding it. It's just something they believe. What's really interesting about that culture, and there's a few more kind of cases from there that, will actually kind of go back to suggesting this idea of souls just being reincarnated. The Tlingit actually brand their children. They'll give them specific brands, specific to that person. And they find that when people are reincarnated, they actually reincarnate with those brands on their bodies. And there's one specific case in that, from the Tlingit culture, a guy named William George Sr., who was kind of approaching the end of his life. And at one point he told his son, if there's anything to this reincarnation business, I'll reincarnate as your son. So this kind of intentional decision to reincarnate. And sure enough, when this guy's son had a child, the child began, at 2 or 3 years old, when most reincarnation cases begin, the child actually did begin to recall the memories of the grandfather's life. And the grandfather said, oh, you'll know if I'm reincarnated by the marks on my body. He had a particular blemish, I think, on his shoulder and his chest. And the child reincarnated with those exact blemishes on his body. And as he grew up, did come to identify with the grandpa, you know, exhibited a lot of the same mannerisms, same kind of proclivities and whatnot. And the whole family accepted him as a reincarnation of the grandfather. So that one's, you know, that one's kind of hard to explain in any other way other than, well, the grandfather just decided to reincarnate and you know, successfully did so and actually came back with, you know, more or less the same body.
Well, one thing that this immediately reminds me of is one of two things. One is demonic possession, because marks could show up on people's bodies by this demonic possession.
Sure.
And the other one would be in Catholic mystical tradition. For example, someone like St. Francis of Assisi claimed to have had the marks of Christ on his wrists and his ankles from the crucifixion on the cross reappear on him, right? So there's a specific word for that, which I can't remember at the time. But those, either one of those could explain marks on a boy, right? I think either one of those could. Now, to your point about like a pre-literate society, yes, they're not going to be thinking about, the nature of the soul. Let me think about that, right? But remember, in India, we're talking about yogis, we're talking about Brahmins. All they have is free time. They don't have to work. They can just sit around and speculate all the time. And then in the Western tradition with Plato and Pythagoras, they had the same luxury. And so if you have that luxury, I expect you to have a really well thought out, defined understanding of God, the soul, and nature. And it seems that when you push on those people who are purporting to give you a well thought out position, it tends to be most commonly believed when these terms are ill-defined. And I feel like both as someone who is doing similar work to you, that's not very scientific. And then second of all, as a philosopher, I found that very unsatisfying as well, because there are assumptions you're not telling me that make it difficult for me to interact with your work.
Right. Sure. No, I mean, I agree with that. I think that's a shortcoming. That's a good criticism. You know, it may just have something to do with the fact that, you know, I feel like in the West, we don't, I feel like I don't know anybody who feels they've been reincarnated. And I don't know anybody who knows someone who feels they've been reincarnated. Whereas in, you know, Asian traditions, it's actually, in Asian cultures, I should say, it's very common to you know, have past life memories. Or I would feel like a much greater share of the population knows someone who has some past life memory or had past life memories as a child. So maybe it's just something, because they see it on a day-to-day basis, they're kind of surrounded with the data. They just sort of take it for granted. They don't feel they have to justify or to prove that kind of notion.
Yeah, that would be like somebody who's like, well, I'm hungry, I need to eat. I don't need to justify to you that I need to eat, right? Kind of like that. But the other ones with the Western parapsychological examples, there's always something that seems a little fishy. Like there's a really famous case where there's a boy that claimed to be a reincarnated World War II fighter pilot. And he had names, he remembered names of all these deceased pilots, and he would go to these, you know, aviator reunion meetings and then just blow them away. But the story just kind of stops. There's multiple reasons why it's suspicious. The parents claimed to be Christian and didn't believe in reincarnation until they said that their son did it. But then when their son becomes a teenager, he stops having these past life experiences, which you shouldn't really have happen if it's reincarnation.
Well, that is something that's observed in the data, though. It's something even Stevens didn't realize right away, is that these children start to have these memories basically as soon as they can talk, around 2 or 3 years old. And basically all of them go away between the ages of 5 and 8. So you have to get these kids really young, because it's just something common across all cases that those memories do disappear.
I think, though, that is an indication of, for lack of a better word, let's just use Frank Herbert's term prescience. It's part of a long-held memory of a people that, because you're a child, you're suggestible, most traditions around the world view children as more innately attuned to the spirit world. For example, Christ says, you know, be like little children. In that regard, I think it's just kind of like a glitch, in the sense that they were particularly attuned at that period in their life to this broader memory of their people that eventually fades as, I guess we could say, to go full Jungian here, right? As they assert their own will over the anima, right? And then that just goes away. So this would be like an anima memory, right? Go full Jung, right?
But then again, that doesn't necessarily explain, you know, why do people reincarnate with birthmarks? Why do they reincarnate with, you know, blemishes? I know that, you know, a specific case, again, I think that Ian Stevenson looked at, where a kid was beheaded and had like was born with kind of a scar across his neck, corresponding exactly to where his head was cut off. So again, if it's a sort of collective thing, like we're just tapping into these kind of memories, then why do we reincarnate with these specific marks on our bodies?
Okay, I think I remember the Catholic term. I think it's called the stigmata,
yeah.
which is where somebody is supposed to have had the marks of Christ on
Right.
them. Okay,
yeah.
So how about this? Okay, what if it were to be the case that a child who has these marks, the past memory of that violent death instigates a stigmata?
Okay. Yeah.
What about that as an explanation? So they are tapping into that past memory, but it's so powerful, and as a child, they're so impressionable, like a piece of wax. You
right.
put a ring in it to have an impression.
Yeah.
That impression is a stigmata.
Right.
How's
now,
that?
Stigmata, we're kind of said to come and go, though, right?
Like well, I guess it depends.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I mean, you could also have marks from like possession, and
right.
if you have an exorcism, that would go away. But I don't think so. If in the account, whether we believe it to be historically accurate completely or not, St. Francis of Assisi, I don't believe lost his stigmata. He achieved it late in life, and then he had it at death.
Right.
So I don't think it went away for him, is what I'm saying.
Okay. So what if, going back to the argument for reincarnation, what if someone does reincarnate as an individual, like the case of the grandson who reincarnated as grandpa, contains all the kind of same markings on their body and all that, carries on the same memories. But for whatever reason, or they're only really able to remember it as a child because, like you said, children are kind of more open to the paranormal, more open to other things happening in the world. And then as he grows up and kind of begins to identify with himself and his ego, or however you want to describe it, that those memories just simply recede. He kind of loses access to them.
So because the anima is being replaced by a more fleshed out own will. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I can't remember Jung's term, but self-idealized or something.
Yeah. And so you're saying that reincarnation could still account for that, but then why would he then lose access to that, though? It may not be a dominant part of his persona at that point, but I don't see why he'd lose access, as many of these cases do.
Right.
Like the boy who was a fighter pilot, allegedly.
Right. Well, it's like, people in many different cultures around the world, people believe that children are more able to see spirits, for example, or more able to see, fairies, or just more access to the kind of spirit world. But then as they grow up and as they kind of become less and less childlike, and kind of identify more, as a distinct human being, that they sort of lose they lose those abilities to kind of see beyond the veil, and they lose memories from past lives, or lose that connection to the collective unconscious.
Yeah. I think maybe a more interesting example might be one of my favorite historical figures, Georges Patton, who believed he was reincarnated from many ancient generals and warlords. And he claimed while he was campaigning in France and Italy that, yeah, he did have those memories. So he's actually an interesting case you don't often hear people talk about. If you're going to be a parapsychological investigator of reincarnation, given that Patton wrote a lot of letters and a lot of people wrote about Patton, it might behoove them to has anybody done that? Do you know? Has anybody read Patton's work and then analyzed Patton as a candidate for reincarnation?
I have never come across it in all my research on reincarnation. No, I wasn't even aware of that one.
That's insane. I can't believe that. I mean, he's probably one of the most famous people of the 20th century who claim to be reincarnated.
Right.
There's a great scene in the film Patton where he's dining with British officers in Sicily, and he's like, one of them says, "You have made a great marshal for Napoleon." And he's like, "I was." And then, it's a great scene. But
there was a case. There was a woman named Dorothy Eady, I think early 20th century Britain, and she claimed to have past life memories of ancient Egypt. And I think, if I'm getting this right, I hope this isn't incorrect, but I think she fell down the stairs or something and began with some sort of head trauma, and then began having these past life memories. And she actually became an Egyptologist later in life and was extremely well respected in her field. She would have, in-depth knowledge of kind of day-to-day life in ancient Egypt that she could not really have got from, sources and texts. And, her colleagues would actually kind of call it spooky. But they all acknowledged that, no, in every case where we were able to kind of verify her claims, she was proven right. And she was a leading Egyptologist for a long time.
Interesting. But with Patton, he doesn't. He again, if we, I believe Patton believed he was reincarnated. I'm not sure I believe that, but he believed it. Right. So when he's saying it, he's not putting on an act. So what I'm saying is that he's very interesting in that he doesn't forget, which is what you see with a lot of these cases as they get older.
Right.
One of the things that, from my point of view, if we don't view reincarnation as a soul-seeding device for the universe, which is typically what it's viewed as, it just seeds the universe with life. You could have a great soul theory where a great souled man, what Aristotle calls a magnanimous man, is able to, through the sheer force of will, imprint himself on the universe. And that gives him the possibility of reincarnation. Now, that's a possibility not open to everyone, which would then sidestep most of my objections based on population growth. What if you reincarnate as an animal? It's totally different than that, right? It's you've done something so great, so profound, or you've shared something with someone. Another good example is the literary work of William Hope Hodgson, where he writes the Nightland, which is basically one of the first post-apocalyptic stories where Earth, the sun has died, and it's this dark, grim world full of monsters. And there's this guy who's reincarnated with his love, separated by a great distance, and they have to find each other. Again, in that case, what causes the reincarnation is the strength of their love. Now, this is not a universal concept now. It's just, the greatness of the deed, if you will, right? The greatness of the deed imprints itself in such a way.
Right.
Which I'm not saying I believe it. I'm just saying that would be a very different kind of reincarnation.
Right. We could also kind of have a hybrid theory that, again, would kind of account for population growth and whatnot, where some people are reincarnated. Some people with a specific mission on Earth are reincarnated over and over. But, other new souls could be added to the population.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to be
some people either die or go to an afterlife, or escape the wheel of samsara and escape the cycle of rebirth, but others kind of continuously go back.
Well, right. I want to be thorough. I want to cover all possibilities, even though, as we've both stated up front, we're not convinced of the idea of reincarnation. I still want to be complete and cover all possibilities, even if it's not one that I necessarily hold to. But I do think that overall, what I would say is that the best inference to all of this phenomenon, not just modern parapsychology, but also the ancient literary tradition of both India and Greece and Rome, is explained with the idea that ideas our soul, our mind, is, God puts the hardware in there with stuff preloaded, which we can test empirically, like with language and Noam Chomsky.
Right.
With also the possibility of prescience, as described by Frank Herbert in Dune, where you have this, adept who's just in touch with all of his people, all of the past. I mean, that's sort of what a Native American vision quest is anyhow. The guy basically goes on a vision quest to speak to his ancestors. Now, is that literally speaking to spirits, or is it, rather than some sort of one way to interpret it, instead of speaking to spirits, is he's opening his third eye so that he can have access to all of his people's memories. Now, the language he has is not expansive enough to explain this that way. He might explain it as just talking to spirits, but what if he's just talking to personas within himself? As Jung says, we have these internal personas, which he can't differentiate given his level of cultural consciousness.
Right. There's also, like the ancient Greek concept of like the daemon, where, or the, what was it, the Roman concept of the genus, where you could
genius,
you could just sort of have these spirits work through you, that they would sort of possess you in the way we kind of, think of demon possession today or spirit possession today, and kind of guide your actions. And, I think a lot of traditions also believe that about their ancestors, that their ancestors could kind of seize them and guide them through a day. Another kind of variation of the possession hypothesis.
Yeah, well, I think we've covered this quite expansively. I think I'm done. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to this before we wrap up.
No, I think we covered our bases.
I think we did. So where can people find you? And I know you're still working on a project. If you want to give us a little more information on that.
Yeah, basically, so I have my website, thinkanomalous.com. I'm on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I only do a video every 3 or 4 months at this point, but I do have another one coming out in about a week. And I'm on Patreon if you want to support me there. And I'm currently working on a book on the airship phenomena of 1896 and 7, greatest UFO wave in history.
All right. Well, thanks again, Jason. It's always a pleasure having you on.
Thank you for having me. Nice talking to you.
All right. This is Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Flight podcast, signing off.